Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
To continue with the elaboration on managing for effectiveness, one needs to do a quick recap of some of the dimensions which are relevant and also try to make it go forward. Please note that self development thus involves learning and growth in all the dimensions. And what are all the dimensions under question? The dimensions under question would be growth in skills, growth in knowledge, growth in attitudes, and growth in values. Well, might one ask, what are the contours of growth on each of these? Growth on the dimension of skills is easy to observe, easy to measure, and easy to demonstrate. So, there is not much of an elaboration needed there. Similarly, growth in knowledge shows by the kind of correlations you can establish and kind of applications that you are able to see, and above all your general analysis and interpretation of a situation. But the two areas where growth is a little more subtle and appreciation of that a little more complicated are the dimensions of attitudes and values. How do you assess that a person is growing in his attitudes? Well, for that a simple maturity scale is needed. A lot of work has been done in behavioral sciences in developing a maturity scale. For example, Freud defined maturity as the ability to go through pleasure and pain without a sense of guilt. Now, that, as you can see, is a clearly Freudian twist. Since a lot of psychoanalysis deals with propositions of guilt, he defines maturity as going beyond guilt to recognizing life as it is, and of course, that can be played back and forth like many things else which many scholars have said, but that will await another discussion. The more important thing is the illustration is meant to show that maturity on attitudes is an index of growth, but then one definition leads to another explanation being required. What is maturity? I just gave you one definition, and there are of course other definitions of maturity, but one common trait to all definitions of maturity is the perspective of walking through something in a well considered manner without getting rattled, without getting upset, without too many fluctuations of moods. Even Gita talks of equanimity, and equanimity is essentially a state of stable emotional frame. without turbulence. And the reason for that is very simple and scientific. Turbulence distorts judgment. And if you get excited and if you get worried and if you tend to brood, then your critical faculties are not at their best. Be that as it may, the need to understand growing attitudes is the need to recognize that to be effective you need to be mature, and whereas there are no limits to maturity, with growing age your ability to understand and cope with life should obviously increase, and that requires an attitudinal growth. Like the study of attitudinal growth, the study of growth of values becomes important, and it is necessary to understand that growing values requires greater ability at reflection and still greater abilities at doing what is good, not just for yourself, but others, and not just for others, to do what is good for all elements in the environment. You do what is good to preserve life in all its manifestations, and you do what is good and correct to preserve the worth of even inanimate subjects. The word subject being used here in the meaning of psychology, an existence, an object, and even material objects which seemingly have no life element in it, play a valuable role in the quality of existence of the planet. So, your growing values should be a factor of growing age. Now, apply that all to managerial effectiveness and you get a situation which can be probably captioned as job potential for self development. After all, self development that we are talking about in this context is self development in a managerial job, and therefore, the job potential must increase. Job potential for effectiveness must increase, and as you go up the ladder, you realize that you need to have a perspective of problem solving with resource optimization, which helps everyone to grow. Hence, there is a static relationship between the job and the manager's self development. They are bounded together. If a manager's self development is on the upward trajectory, the quality of the job discharge, the quality that he brings upon doing his job will continuously go on rising and improving. Because one needs to remember that a manager is a manager is a manager, and what does that mean when one says a manager is a manager is a manager? You can have the same job being occupied by different people who will discharge their job in different styles, because managers bring his personality with him. And if you bring your personality with you, your style varies. and therefore, the act of job discharge has a whole spectrum of possibilities which need to be a bounded situation, because the spectrum of possibilities cannot take you outside the job boundaries. Because if you go beyond job boundaries, you are in a state of conflict with somebody else's job. So, the statement that a manager has to perform the role in the context of his role set. Please read this sentence very carefully, because it is an important sentence. A manager has to perform his role in the context of the role set, which means essentially it is the job which requires the skills of the manager. His effectiveness will be a factor of the excellence and the efficiency which he brings upon the tasks which he is handling. Effectiveness would mean that he is capable of achieving the levels of results which his job requires him to. But on the other hand, he cannot work as an autonomous variable. So, the interplay between his skills and the tasks is the real measurement of effectiveness. This diagram shows to you in a set of boxes the relationship between job and self development, and how it is a static relationship. Please absorb this, then I will give you my comments. Now, like everything else, it begins with environment. The environment works through institutions. Institutions have role sets. Role sets require roles, and roles are discharged by people who have a self, who have an existence. Now, the interaction between these 5 elements is the path that effectiveness will take. Effectiveness, as has been pointed out to you, will require efficiency. It will require efficiency at the institutional level. What would efficiency mean here? If a message is given, it gets to its recipient in the minimal possible time. Role set will have efficiency in correlation of the tasks, in passing on the messages amongst the tasks. Role will require excellence. All this put together would require self development, something which I have been trying to draw your attention to and have been dwelling upon. Obviously, self development and managing self is a huge domain on which many specializations occur, but at the level of your learning and the level of your requirement, it may be suffice to say that self development is a matter of concern of any manager, any decision maker, and any person who has anything to do with action in an organizational environment. Therefore, the role set typically is made up of his personality, the personality of his immediate superior, the personality of other functional supervisors, and personality of colleagues at his level. In each case, personality is common to all of them. The role set typically is made up of his personality, of his immediate superior's personality, of other functional supervisors and colleagues at his level. How does personality become a factor of effectiveness? Personality has everything to do with temperament. Temperament has everything to do with one's ability to handle disappointments and success. It has everything to do with the other person's ability to handle disappointments and success. His ability to keep his temper, his ability to bring on to job patience and perseverance, his ability to communicate with an openness which is a personality factor. So, several of the elements which go into the making of a manager's effectiveness or an organization's effectiveness require an understanding of the intangible elements of human action. And if the personality of everyone is relevant, so is the personality of subordinates, the skills of the subordinates, the ability of the subordinates to take responsibility for their action, because there may be such a thing as delegation upwards. A role set itself functions within an overall organization. Finally, the organization has to operate in a wide environment. So, again a tripartite relationship has to be understood. The human beings involved enter into an interactory relationship. They interact with reference to each other's roles as much as their own role. Their own role is set in functions in an organizational context, and the organizational context has to work in an environmental context, and if it is working in an environmental context, the nature of one will permeate into the other and touch the individual, and that is a point which repeatedly comes up and which needs to be understood if you are to understand effectiveness, and you are to understand how effectiveness is derived from efficiency and how effectiveness is derived from excellence. The factors which affect self development are low awareness of self. What am I about? Now, this question of what I am about in this managerial environment is not simply a philosophical question. It is a question of your sound awareness of your skills and your ability to carry out tasks which will leave an impact on the work environment. The other objective factors which go into determining your effectiveness is your role clarity. The role may be clear, but do you understand the role? That role is going to be the channelization of your skills. That role is going to be your operational theatre of action. And if you are conscious of what you are about managerially, and if you are conscious of what the job requires you to put on the ground, then it is logical that some of it may be a little more than your liking, a little less than your expectations, and hence the point that there could be role stress being caused by incompatible expectations in the role set. So, role stress, incompatible expectations and role set are mutually related to each other, and your ability to handle your role stress is a very important ingredient of effectiveness. So, now we are adding to the concern of effectiveness another dimension. Can you hold your own? In the times which we live in, we find that the quality of role stress has gone ahead far beyond the anticipated levels when one enters into a job. People are progressively finding that the person with whom they are dealing is not as reasonable as they would want him to be. Why? Even the people with whom you are not in an active job relationship can cause stress. Look at the multiple cases of road rage which come. Another person in another vehicle, or he does not even have to be in a vehicle, he just has to cause stress on others by the way he walks across a road. He is not related to you, but he decides that that is the point of the road where he wants to walk through. And if you do not drive carefully, and if you so much as scrape by his side, there is trouble. So, the number of times the heart skips a beat while you are on a road affects everyone. The cyclist is equally worried about what the motorist may do. The pedestrian is worried about what will happen, just as he worries the person at the wheels. So, what is the message which comes out of all this? You have to be an evolved self. You have to be a person who is cognizant of what you are causing to yourself and causing to others to be successful in a work situation. Not many people have the ability to realize what they are doing to others. The touchstone is they want results for themselves, and they do not often realize that you can't get results for yourself unless you get the other person equally in an operational frame of mind, or in a state of mind which is relaxed and therefore optimal in decision making. So, the art of effectiveness lies in controlling yourself, and also, if I might say so, in managing others in a non-obtrusive manner, so that the others can fulfill your expectations better. Therefore, reasonableness of behavior towards others is really enlightened self-interest. And predictably, then we enter into another aspect of the operations of management. You may have all the personal skills, You may have all the elements of maturity, you may have all the elements of managing yourself and others, but the organizational weaknesses prevent optimal results. Organizational weaknesses may be emerging out of system aberrations, which have to do with faulted structures. Work was never designed proactively. Worse, it is designed in one way on paper and it is quite another way in operation. Therefore, exercise of authority would be as per assumptions of the work design on paper, but the work being actually discharged is on a completely different set of parameters. And so, your command sequence is not consistent with the operational structural sequence of work. Therefore, there is dissonance and therefore, there will be ineffectiveness. How do you do this? A difficult question to answer. It is difficult because of several parameters. One of the basic ones being that singly and individually you can't carry out organizational redesign. Remember, organization development is defined as planned change from the top. The man on the top may be not convinced of the argument to change. Worse, he may not be capable of understanding it, or even if he understands it, of executing it. Well, then it becomes one of the givens of life. You have got to learn to live with it, you have got to learn to cope with it. You have to learn to walk through it and at least try to be effective in your own job and be conscious that ultimately in the overall organizational and the work completion frame, the results may not come in because others are not performing at the same level. And they again may not be at fault. It is a structural weakness of the organization, and in my limited experience of consulting, researching, practicing in the industry, I have found that one of the most difficult things to convey to top management is the structural weakness of an organizational frame. They do not even understand what a structural weakness is about in many cases, but since they hold the rank of an organizational superior, their obiter dicta, that is their pronouncement on what the situation in the organization is about, will hold, will operate, and will be a factor of with what speed and with what energy would organizational renewal take place, if at all. In the meanwhile, the organizational weaknesses will persist if they are there, and even if the organizational weaknesses are not there, but the organization is not in a developmental mode, then organizations will become obsolete in slow incremental degrees and their effectiveness will reduce. Hence, a very simple proposition. Organizational renewal is an essential ingredient of overall organizational action. Any organization which does not keep renewing itself is bound to get into trouble. Unfortunately, most organizations tend to function without a conscious organizational renewal approach. The organizational renewal which takes place in this organization, that is an organization of this breed, takes place because of what would be an approach by reflex to renew the organization, because you see something going wrong and you keep correcting it in small bits. But reflex corrective action in small bits will never be a substitute for an overall conscious organizational redesign renewal effort. And you have heard me state in many different ways, each organization is in a state of redesign, because that is the way it will be if it is an evolving organization. Add to it the concerns of unclear, inappropriate strategy, and you have a situation which is confounded. And anyone knows confusion when confounded can be quite a terrible situation to deal with. So, what is it that I am saying? I am submitting for your consideration a very simple proposition. The proposition is, effectiveness requires a certain quality of organizational strength, organizational health, organizational vitality, and from the narration so far, meaning of health, vitality should be clear. It should be a functioning organization capable of achieving its goals with a certain degree of efficiency, a certain degree of excellence. But that itself will not happen unless proper strategies are in place, and proper strategies require conscious action. Strategies will always be there, but they will be always suboptimal if they are unconscious strategies, and they will require interventions of creating actual operational strategies which have been well thought through. So, we go back to looking at self development and organization development in a joint mode, and let us switch back to looking at what would be the difficulties of self development. The list is long. The list is so long that it will be impossible to exhaustively describe them, but let me walk you through at least 4 of them, which may be somewhat enlightening to those of you who feel involved sufficiently as managers to develop yourself to create an environment of effectiveness around you. The first difficulty in self development is dogmatism. When you are dogmatic, you tend to believe that you know it all. I have a case where a senior ranking police officer came to me with a situation where he felt certain structural aspect of a state's police headquarters needed to be re-looked at, and would I find time to do a scientific analysis to recast it. Since he was number 2 or 3, I forget at what level, but he was very much at the top, I suggested that he should have a discussion with the top man. And he said, would you like to talk to him? I said, no, I would not like to talk to him, because A, I do not know him, B, he will have all the reservations of a practicing police official and I may be just considered theoretical, I may be considered from an ivory tower, I may be looked at as a person, what does he know of the police force, has he ever worked in a police force. All those arguments which are so easy to believe when you do believe that your own profession is the top of the heap, and all sorts of prejudices which go with it. All professions have their prejudices, and all sample size has its exceptions. So, there is no point in saying I do not have any prejudices. It is possible you do not have any prejudices, but I would put you under a group of people who are exceptions rather than the rule. But to get back to the story, on my persuasion he did go and discuss it with the top man. Back he came with the reply. The top man says, what will the doctor tell us which we do not know? Then I said, pause there. If the doctor can tell you nothing more which you do not know, then surely you must have solutions to all the problems that you do know. He said, yes, it is logical to follow up statement number 1 with statement number 2. I said, therefore, statement number 3, if you do know all that is to be known, and if you do know what to do with the problems which exist, then answer a simple question, why is it not done? That is the catch. It is not done because there is a deficiency somewhere. The capacity of decision making is not lodged where the problem is. The resources may be inadequate. The political will to change may be deficient. The skills required to cause the change may not be there. All of them may be there, but the time to put it in action may not be there. And even if all of it is there, perhaps it has not been adopted as an action point. Therefore, somebody needs to serve as a champion to put it as an action point. And I went on with the list and I said, that is what the effectiveness specialist will do to the organization, but I suggest the effort be dropped because your top man has the characteristic of being dogmatic. He is firm on his opinion, there is no scope for change, and therefore, the only change which will take place would be either the change which takes place as a natural process, or what I term as the change under distress. So, my first proposition to you, dogmatism is one of the major difficulties in self development. The second is intellectual lethargy. Intellectual lethargy is more corrosive than physical lethargy. It may sound strange, but it is true that a lot of people are simply allergic to intellectual effort, and when they proclaim themselves to be practical people and they look down upon any approach which propounds any theory, what they are actually saying is that we are so high and mighty that we are not convinced that there is anything more to acquire, and anyhow thinking is such a pain, I prefer not to think. And a third level of evolution of that thought, why think when life is going on in a quite a reasonable manner, because they do not realize that actually they cannot put up with the pain of thinking. which is why one of the end products of any learning or education process is the ability to think. This ability to think requires a certain wherewithal to deliver, and that certain wherewithal to deliver requires intellectual stimulation for action. Intellectual stimulation requires sourcing of information and sourcing of knowledge. Sourcing of knowledge and sourcing of information is itself an art which has to be acquired. People do not often know how to source information, where to get the answers. Remember, one needs even skills to source a thesaurus, or if that is too difficult a concept for you to grasp, to source a dictionary. One must know how a word can be found in a dictionary. There are other subtle and not so subtle skills required for self development, and one of them is motivation. So, the difficulty is arrested motivation. Life has ceased to interest you. Life does not offer to you any challenges which you are willing to accept. So, you had the motivation, you are now happy to move with the stream, you have reached a state of drift which gives you a false sense of comfort, and you do not have the will to get beyond it. This is known as arrested motivation. But if you think dogmatism, intellectual lethargy, arrested motivation are problems, wait till you are reminded of the fourth problem or difficulty in self development, and this really takes the cake. The problem of defensiveness. You cannot bear scrutiny. Any suggestion is seen as an offensive act. You see any attempt to help you as the other person attempting to demean you. And you are conscious all along that you are not able to do it without help, but yet if you accept help, it is an acceptance of failure. Therefore, you take it upon yourself to keep defending whatever you are doing, where very often you know that what you are doing is wrong. But if you did not defend yourself, your ego would be hurt, and your ego would be hurt up to a point where you are not willing to recognize that you deserve inputs which lead to self development, and that input is being provided not to prove you wrong, but to make you optimally efficient and optimally effective, and make sure whatever you do is done in an excellent manner. Therefore, effectiveness requires a whole set of roadblocks to be removed. Not only have a whole set of roadblocks to be removed, but a whole set of accelerators have to be put in position. Not only a whole set of accelerators have to be put in position, but you have to be made a growing and a learning person who believes in himself, loves himself enough to keep growing. This kind of a manager is obviously more effective in a work situation. But then again, to go to the other component of effectiveness, that is the organizational aspects. One of the traits of managers in work situation which will get results is the ability to delegate. So, I bring up the topic of self development through delegation, and a simple proposition is put across to you. There is much scope for development through delegation, but you can clearly see the key concept in effectiveness is development. It can be self development, it can be organizational development, but there is no getting away from development. And tools of effectiveness therefore, has anything to do which develops the individual, which develops structures, processes, designs, puts them in a developmental frame, communication patterns, and like everything else, this is beset with difficulties, but the difficulties can be overcome by a conscious effort. We will be paying attention to this conscious effort in course of time, and it may be a good idea for you to take a look at the concept of development before we close this part of the discussion, because there are really three dimensions to development, be it individual or be it personal. Development of the individual is in formal organizations requires both job competencies and personal growth. Please note this as one of the conclusions which you need to take away. Development of individual in formal organizations requires both, that is his development in his job competencies and personal dimension. Development of enterprise or other types of systems requires the ability to cope with this growth. Growth which is taking place in the external environment, growth which is taking place internally, so that each dimension has internal consistency with the next level of growth. Development of the wider economy through growing institutions. So, individual, organization and the wider economy, because there are regulatory agencies, there are policy framing agencies, there are funding agencies, there are agencies which deal with supply chain, there are agencies which deal with purchase. Above all, there are agencies of civil society, those which deal with public utilities, those which deal with law and order situation. So, unless each institution is growing, corporate growth is not possible and effectiveness will forever be effective. We shall look at all this in course of time.